For this next class, we're going to have a closer look at some of the core foundations behind sound editing, specifically syncing audio, using crossfades and other fades, and layering. As you can see, our effects tracks are quite minimal. This is for two reasons. The first is because I guess there weren't that many sound effects events in the scene that would be, typical of a much larger session. And also because I'm a big believer in specificity. What separates often a good sound design from a not so good one is that every sound has its place and that every sound punches. And early on in my career, I tried to make my sounds bigger by adding more and more sounds. But ultimately what that does is it clutters up a track. It removes focus from any defining sound. It creates a bit of a mixing nightmare because now you have lots of sounds all vying for a limited frequency bandwidth, and more often than not, you lose a lot of the focus and a lot of the punch when you layer on sound too thickly. Clarity is everything, and every sound you use must have a very, very specific reason why you've used that sound to ultimately help the story. And here, to do that, we have our basic sync effects, which we had a look at earlier, which are the door closes and the drop of the jewelry. And then over here, we have all of our wood creaks. Beneath that in the Foley tracks, obviously the layering becomes a little more intense. But even then, you could see that each of these, man holding down, nurse, nurse 2, are sounds which specifically link to different events or people in the frame, and giving us the freedom to, as they were recorded as separate tracks, to mix between them and choose where to place the focus. And for this scene, all focus is on Sebastian and his screaming. And so even though a lot of tracks were recorded, the way that they were used were ultimately to create movement and detail around the core sound. But the focus, the very focus of this scene, is the sound of Sebastian screaming, and therefore everything else sort of took a back seat to that. With regards to syncing audio, again, there are many techniques to do this. It's my preference to drop into grid mode, which when you zoom into a track, which we do by pressing Option and using the scrolly wheel on your mouse, you see every individual frame of the film. And so in the event of the door close, we can go by going frame by frame. So that's the frame where the door is closed. I put in a marker by using the Enter button on the Apple keyboard and Enter. And then we see the transient of the sound, which is a little bit off. And we move that over until it snaps. To give you more freedom, you can move into slip mode, which means the movements of the regions are not dictated by the frames themselves. And so if we sync that up, let's have a little listen. Let's zoom out a little bit.
You are not allowed to.
Looking at the types of crossfades and fades that we've used. Now, each fade serves a specific purpose, and let's take a look at those now. So, you add a fade by selecting the area that you would like to fade up or down from, and then pressing Command F brings up this window over here with the fades. Now, if you select Standard Equal Gain, you get these fade options over here. And without going into too much detail, the more the incline, the more rapidly the sound goes down. This being the quickest tail down, this being the most gradual. And there is the equal power, where we can start to use S-curves, which start the sound louder and then quickly taper it down. Now, there are no rules at all when using fades. I think a lot of people will tell you that there are, or they'll give preferences as to certain fades that achieve certain things. In reality, it's experimentation which will ultimately dictate the choices you make with fades. Sometimes you want something to come up really quickly and loudly, other times you want them to taper down. In either which way, it's very good sound practice, even if you're not using an overt fade that cuts through a sound, to fade all of your regions up and down. And the reason for this is to avoid clipping. Sometimes if you cut a sound off mid sound wave, it can cause a distracting click, and so to avoid that, it's best to top and tail all of your effects with a fade, even if it's a tiny one. Okay, so another area of this sound design which demonstrates the use of fades quite well is down here in all of the space recordings. Now, as you can see, we've got very long fade downs happening there, which basically is my way of saying that I'd still like to basically hear the essence of this sound over here, but without the full impact where we leave this totally open. Other sounds are just cut slam short. Because the door close was such a loud sound, it created the perfect opportunity to ditch other sounds beyond a certain point, and that's why that one's been cut so short. Here we have an S-curve where we want it to be loud. Because this sound over here was picking up in intensity, that sound goes down. And again, with specificity, even though there are so many tracks here, you can see that these tracks over here are filling up a hole left behind by these tracks, which have all been faded down or stopped. This is a track that fills out like a middle region, which is part of the transition between the tracks that we've stopped here and the ones that continue out. And then as far as what happens by the time we get to the end of the scene, there are only really this track remaining at full volume, and then these other ones which are fading down. And in this way, so much of the mixing happens in the edit, just by choosing what sounds appear when, and then so you create as many holes and opportunities for other sounds to be heard. If we were to just play all of these sounds across the entire scene, it would definitely cloud things up, causing the track to be muddy. So let's take a closer look at mixing in the next class, where we will look at dynamics, EQ, and panning.